Super creative.
As far back as I can remember, I wanted to be an astronaut. It didn't happen, but it's never too late to reach for the stars. Welcome to Observatory, where we embark on adventures in space!
The moon and the planets are there.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Welcome back to Observatory. I'm your host, Jeff Bezos. Just kidding, but with the haircut, kinda. Wish I had the bank account, but thanks to astrophotography, I am poor, and you will be too if you take up this hobby. So I warn you now. So today is World Astronomy Day, so I'm wearing my Canadian Space Agency flight suit in order to celebrate, and I just got through doing a talk for Simon Fraser University and the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, and I thought that I would re-record it so that I can share it with you. This basically chronicles my journey over the last few years of getting into astrophotography. So this is going to be a high-level kind of introduction to astrophotography. We're going to take a look at different types of astrophotography, some of the gear, and some photos, of course, because that is the name of the game. So without further ado, let's just dive right in. Why astrophotography? Well, I love space, always have. I am a filmmaker and photographer, and I started my career about 20 years ago working on TV shows like Stargate, SG-1, and Atlantis. So any opportunity I have to marry space and cameras is a good one. And thanks to the pandemic, yes, I said thanks to the pandemic, work ground to a halt. And I had a bunch of extra time on my hands, and some people, they started baking sourdough bread. I took up astronomy and astrophotography. So this is really my journey from, I guess, February, March of 2020 to now in 2022. So about 2 years as an astrophotographer, and I'm a little bit obsessive about it, so we've covered a lot of ground. So let's begin. We are going to start off talking about a regular camera on a tripod. And as the talk progresses, we're going to add more and more equipment, spend more money, and hopefully get better results. So I'll show you that every step of the way as we go through this. I think a camera and a tripod is a good place to start. I'm a photographer, so I had it. You may have this stuff as well. This is maybe not considered an astronomical image per se, but it is the sun interacting with moisture in our atmosphere. I took this pre-pandemic, pre-astrophotography from my roof. But I think it's a very cool image of the sky, and it's a rare occurrence. Let's take a look at another rare occurrence. These are called noctilucent clouds. This happens after the sun is set, but the angle of the sun is still hitting the sky. So it's not lighting up the Earth, but it's hitting these ice crystals, which are quite high in the atmosphere. Some scientists say that some of this ice comes into the upper atmosphere from meteors. So a very rare occurrence. I've only seen it once before. I just thought, hey, cool clouds. Didn't photograph it. Then when it happened again, I knew what it was, so I raced out. So if you see clouds that look like this late in the evening in the summer, grab your camera. These are noctilucent clouds, a very rare occurrence and well worth documenting. They're quite beautiful, kind of iridescent, different looking clouds for sure. Okay, what's another rare occurrence that happens in the sky that's absolutely stunning that we can photograph? The Northern Lights. The Aurora Borealis over Vancouver. Very rare occurrence. Shout out to my wife for being on Twitter and knowing that it was starting to happen and letting me know so I could run up to the roof. And this, perhaps my favorite image over the last 2 years, maybe longer, is the full Vancouver skyline with the aurora above it. Just absolutely stunning. This only happened for a few minutes, so the fact that I was able to capture it, this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I'm so very grateful that I both got to see it and photograph it so I can share it with you and the rest of the world. Fingers crossed that I get another chance at this. Okay, so if you leave your house, you can get darker skies, more stars, and even the Milky Way. I shot this photo on a tripod with a camera up in Whistler, British Columbia. Very nice dark skies up there away from the city. And I did 2 exposures, one for the sky, one for the lake. So the one for the lake is about 4 or 5 minutes, and the one for the sky probably about 30 seconds. And we'll talk a little bit more about the technique on how to use your camera on the tripod in a moment, give you some tips. Here is Tofino, British Columbia on Vancouver Island, and another stunning Milky Way shot, and with a great foreground. I think when you can connect the sky and the earth, it's magic. A lot of astrophotography is really centered on the sky, but I think we can relate to it better when we have terrestrial subjects and a landscape or people in the shot as well. It really brings it all together. So I love any chance I can get to get out of town and actually see the Milky Way, because I live in the city and we can't see it. All right, so here's a couple tips if you're using a camera and a tripod. Use a wide, fast lens. You want to capture the landscape and the sky in one shot. So this was taken with a 20mm lens on a full frame camera. I would say anything 24mm and wider is good. And ideally f2 and faster. f2.8 can work, but you want to get down into the sub f2 category, 1.8, 1.4, 1.2. Really fast lens to soak up as much light as possible and maximize what you can do on a camera and a tripod. Lower your ISO setting to as low as you can to make the exposure. It's going to be a cleaner shot, because the higher your ISO goes, the more noise the sensor produces, and that's not what you want. So that's where that fast lens comes in handy. Now, the next one, this is really the secret to doing Milky Way photography or any astrophotography, is the 500 rule. So we're going to take the number 500, divide it by the focal length of your lens, and this is going to equal the amount of seconds that we can expose the shot for. In other words, your shutter speed. So in this case, we take 500, divide it by 20mm, which is our 20mm lens, and we get 25 seconds. Help out with this. PhotoPills is both an app and a website. You can put your camera in, your lens, and where you live, and it'll calculate how long your maximum exposure is without the stars starting to blur from movement. Very helpful to use an app like that. Final tip, use a remote trigger or the shutter delay on your camera, because you don't want the camera to move. So remote shutter will work. You don't have to touch the camera, or use the delay so it stops shaking by the time the shutter actuates and takes the photo. And this will help you get some stunning Milky Way landscape shots. Let's step it up a little bit, shall we? We are going to get into some dedicated astrophotography gear, and if you're like me and you live in the city, I live in a Bortle 8 to 9 zone. If you look at this photo on screen right now, you can see the city skyline behind my astrophotography setup. I live right in the middle of noise pollution. I see a lot of people talk about how they shoot in, heavy Bortle 8 zones, but I live right in the middle of the city, right next to the skyscrapers. So it's a white zone. It's insane. So we're going to need some specialized equipment, and this is why I say AKA goodbye savings here on the slide, because you're going to see we're just going to keep buying one thing after another, and the costs are going to keep going up astronomically, if you will. I have a child now, so I'm allowed to make dad jokes, just so you know I got the pass. First up is a star tracker. Now, I'm going to recommend this as your first piece of gear because it's a very versatile piece of equipment for astrophotography. The premise is that the Earth rotates on its axis, and this makes it appear that the stars are moving. Really, we're moving, but it appears that the stars are moving because of this motion. So a star tracker is going to counteract this motion, and instead of that 25-second exposure we get on a tripod, this is going to allow us to expose for much longer. A camera on a star tracker, we're going to go 1 minute to 3 minutes, depending on your focal length of lens. That is a lot more. So this will work with your DSLR, mirrorless camera. It's going to give us those longer exposures. It's portable. This goes on a tripod, so you can take this with you to go do your Milky Way photography, or even other nebulas and whatnot. It's very versatile, as you're going to see. You can shoot the sun, the moon, the planets, nebulas, galaxies. Very versatile, as I mentioned. You can use a traditional camera lens or as you will probably eventually upgrade to a telescope, it will be able to accept a small telescope as well. And the interesting thing about using this is that you have to manually line up your targets. So you're going to manually dial in the position of the tracker when you're photographing your target. And this is going to help you learn the night sky. We use a technique called star hopping. You're going to pick a very prominent star in the sky, line up your shot on that, and from there you're going to kind of zero in on the target you're hunting for. So you're going to start learning the stars, the constellations. It really gives you a good chance to learn the night sky as you star hop around. So it's a great piece of kit for that. It's not all automated and taken care of for you. That manual hands-on experience is a great way to begin the hobby. You can move up to that automated system later, but pay your dues on a manual system like this and really learn the craft, learn the night sky, and it's going to be of great service to you down the road. Something like this is going to run you about $500. You can find it on Amazon, buy the bundle because you want the extras that come with it. Don't cheap out. There's a new version of this available, I should mention, and has Wi-Fi and some other nifty features. So buy the latest one that you can get at the time of viewing. All right, a telescope. Seems pretty natural if we're going to do some astrophotography. Maybe you want to add a telescope into the mix. I say you'll never stop at one because you probably won't. There are a lot of different things that you can photograph in the night sky, be it planets, the moon, the sun, nebulae, galaxies, and each one requires a different tool for the job. So at this point I have three. I have one that I primarily use for the moon and planets. I have one that I use for solar photography, and one that I use for mostly nebulas and galaxies. And it's kind of all over the map. Mine are mostly entry level. This big telescope you see in the shot here is about $350, and that'll get you some really nice views of the moon. With a DSLR, it'll be pretty much fill up the frame. If you use a small astronomy camera, you're going to get it even tighter on that. And with an eyepiece, you can definitely see the rings of Saturn. You can see details on Jupiter. You can see the 4 Galilean moons. It gets the job done. It's a great entry-level telescope for this type of work. Works great for photography as well, and I've even shot some stuff, terrestrial photography, which you're going to see in a moment. My solar scope, very entry level, is about $1,000. Not bad for solar photography, trust me. And deep sky, I have a William Optics Redcat 51, and it's kind of in between a camera lens and a telescope because of its Petzval design. It has basically a turn to focus ring, just like a camera lens, and it makes it very familiar for me as a photographer to make that leap into astrophotography. A lot of telescopes are much different and require more fine-tuning. So I think something like this, a good wide field refractor, is the way to begin your search for your first astro telescope. And here is the first image. This is shot with a Panasonic mirrorless camera and our SkyMax $350 telescope. And as you can see, we've captured some nice detail on the moon and also some nice color. This is 50 photographs stacked. So again, we're using that star tracker to counteract the night sky, and that keeps us on the moon without having to move the camera. And then we have that telescope, and this gives us a beautiful shot for not a lot of money. Okay, so we've got our tracker, and now we have a telescope. We've taken a shot with our camera, and it's worked out really well, but we want to branch off and shoot more than just the moon. So what's our next step? Well, maybe it's a modified camera. So I want you to think about the rainbow, the whole visible spectrum of light. And a lot of the gas in space lies just outside the edge of what a camera sees. And that's because we filter that out. When you're taking a regular photo here on Earth, we don't want the infrared and ultraviolet light getting into our photos. So we put a filter on the camera to get rid of that. For astrophotography, we do want to tap into those wavelengths, so what we need to do is remove the filter from the camera. In this case, I did it myself. My camera had been damaged in the water down in Santa Monica, and I had to replace the screen. While I was in there, I thought, hey, the camera's already half apart. Let's take the sensor out. So I did. I modified it. It became an infrared sensitive camera. This is going to allow us to add some filters to the camera to help us photograph the gases in space. Now, I don't recommend you do this yourself. Please don't. You'll probably destroy your camera. It's a miracle that mine still functions. You're going to pay about $350 Canadian, about $250 US for this type of conversion. And you'll see the last point on my slide here, ensure compatibility with capture software. In a moment, we're going to add more gear to the mix. And if you're going to do this to a camera that you already own, or you're going to buy a modified camera, I want you to make sure that it is compatible with software on laptop to get the most out of the software and future-proof yourself. So mostly Canon cameras are the most compatible. Okay, quick recap. We have our star tracker, we have a telescope, we've modified the camera, lots of steps here. And now we're going to add in something called auto guiding. So we're adding in a second telescope and camera, they're fairly affordable, and a small computer. What this does is it locks onto stars and it works with our star tracker to keep us on target, to keep our guiding perfect. So we're counteracting the rotation of the Earth, and the longer we expose for, the more accurate that has to be. Same thing with focal length. The longer our focal length gets, the more accurate that tracking has to be. So adding in auto guiding is essential for deep sky astrophotography. And something like this is a bundle from ZWO. This is the ASI Air Pro. You get the scope, the camera, and the ASI Air Pro, which is basically a Raspberry Pi computer in a box that connects to an app on your phone, and you can automate your whole astrophotography session. This is kind of the brain of the operation, and that's why I want you to get a camera that works with the system so that you can take full advantage of the setup. Okay, so quick recap. Mount, telescope, modified camera, and auto guiding. What are the results of all our efforts? Not bad. I'm going to be honest, when I first took this photo, I thought it was miraculous. I shot this from my roof in the heart of the city, and speaking of hearts, this is the Heart Nebula in the constellation Cassiopeia. I believe it's about 7,500 light years from Earth. Quite a distance. Now, this was taken with a Panasonic mirrorless camera through the scope. And it was my first image, and I think it's incredible that I was managed to capture it. And I went on to capture an image the following evening as well. This is the Elephant Trunk Nebula. And you can see in these images, I'm using a filter to help bring out those gases. That's where the modified camera comes into play. And now you can see the red is hydrogen gas in space, excited by those hot young stars in the center of the nebula. It makes them glow, makes the gas bright and come alive, especially in that red wavelength. And here I'm using a duo filter on the camera, so I'm getting oxygen and hydrogen, and you can see kind of two colors within the image. The thing is, for as nice as I think these images are at the time, I knew that I could do better. I've seen a lot of images online, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, the web in general. I've seen what comes out of a lot of people's cameras, and it was a lot nicer than what I was getting. So I knew that there was something missing from the equation. The astronomy camera is the next step in our upgrade path. The big difference between an astronomy camera and a regular camera is cooling. It has thermoelectric cooling built into the camera sensor to help dissipate heat, plus a fan to offload that heat. What does this do? Well, it helps us reduce noise in our long exposure photography. The hotter the camera and sensor gets, doing these long 5-minute exposures one after another, it creates more noise, more grain in the image. By cooling the camera down, it's going to help us eliminate that noise. We're also going to shoot something called a dark frame. If you've ever used a DSLR and done long exposure, it shoots a second photo afterwards, blocking the sensor, and it generates a noise pattern. And then it reduces and subtracts that noise pattern from the image. We're going to do the same thing with this. We're going to shoot photos with the lens cap on. And if you can match the temperature with your regular photos, it's going to help subtract that noise more easily. So having a temperature-controlled camera means that however long you're shooting for, you can make the frames to subtract that noise from the shot more easily. So it's a huge boon to astrophotography. It's one of the essential pieces to get really clean, nice, low noise night sky images. The other thing about an astronomy camera is that most of them are monochromatic. You can get color cameras as well, but I highly recommend a monochromatic camera because that will allow us to use filters. We can use narrowband filters, which will help us get photos that look very similar to the Hubble Space Telescope. And these narrowband filters, they reject a lot of the light pollution. So for someone like me in the city, it's essential to reject all that disgusting noise from streetlights and skyscrapers and focus just on the beautiful light that's coming from those gases and the nebulas and galaxies up above. Next up, let's take a look at the color matrix filter. So this is one of the big differentiators between the monochromatic camera and a regular color camera, is that there's a filter sitting on top of the camera sensor that helps produce those colors. It sends colors to the pixels on your camera. And you'll see that they're grouped together in groups of 4. And there's always 2 green, so red, green, green, blue. Blue, green, green, red, depending on the camera. The issue with this is that there's not a lot of green in space. So having 50% of your pixels be highly specific to shooting the color green and not having anything green to shoot is very inefficient. So a monochromatic camera, besides being able to zero in on those emission lines of light that are coming from our nebulas, well, it's going to give us a lot more light in general because we're not focused on just green. So much more efficient. And something to consider is a filter wheel. So we need to use filters with our mono camera. You can put them in a filter wheel. It's going to work with that little computer, that ASI Air that we picked up a couple steps ago. And it's going to run those filters automatically at night. You can set up the program. You can go to sleep. It's going to rotate through your filters as you sleep and get all your different shots so you can put them together later. These filters, like I said, same technique that the Hubble Space Telescope uses. It's called narrowband. You can still shoot color images, you just use different filters. You would use LRGB, red, green, blue, and L is luminance. That's where your detail comes from. So this definitely takes more work. Instead of just shooting the same thing once with a color imager and then stacking a bunch of those shots, we have to do that for 4 different filters. So you're going to end up with a lot more photos this way, but the results are well worth it. Something like this, a filter wheel and the filters, is going to run you about $500. So let's take a look at the return on our investment. Tracker, telescope, astronomy camera, auto guiding, and special filters. What do we get for all of that? Quite a lot, I'd say. This is the same Heart Nebula that we saw before. Let's take a look at our earlier shot. That's with the modified camera. This is with a dedicated astronomy camera. It's leaps and bounds. Instead of being able just to capture 1 or 2 different colors of gas, we've been able to capture 3 separately and manipulate those 3 different images to give us a much more nuanced color palette. A lot more detail. A lot higher resolution. Just stunning. This is my very first shot. That's with the Star Adventurer Pro and the William Optics Red Cat 51 and the ASI Air 183 Pro camera. They work together extremely well. Beautiful, beautiful photo. Big upgrade over our previous effort with the modified mirrorless camera. A few facts about this image, in case you're wondering about how long it takes to create these images. This is 275 individual images, so that's through 3 different filters. So you can divide that by 3. It's pretty close to 100 shots per filter. I shot over 100 shots, but we got rid of a bunch that didn't work out too well. Each photo is 5 minutes long, 300 seconds long. Together, that's over 23 hours of exposure time. And I remember this was 7 nights. I live in Vancouver. It's a rainforest. We call it Rain City. So you get a few hours each night, and those 7 nights were probably spanned over a month. So a lot of patience in astrophotography. Took me about 8 to 12 hours to process this. This was the first image I ever edited. That was this involved. So I used new software. It took me a long time. It's much faster now, But just anticipate that the learning curve and the time you put into creating these images is quite a bit longer than your average photo. I mean, 23-hour exposure. But well worth it. I think it's absolutely stunning what you can accomplish. Okay, I lied. We're going to update one more piece of gear, and I promise you this is our last update. You know, your credit card's probably already hurting if you're on track with me and we're doing all these updates. So we're going to use a go-to mount. Now, a go-to mount is basically the same thing as our star tracker, except the computer can tell it where to go. So that Heart Nebula that we just saw, let's go back for 1 second. Heart Nebula, I can go into the app on my phone, pick it up and say, go to the Heart Nebula. It'll slew the telescope right over to the Heart Nebula and be ready to shoot. And when you're shooting the same object night after night, you want to frame it the same way. This can actually go and read the coordinates from your last photo and take you right there. So you're ready to go again in a matter of seconds. It makes your life really easy. Now, I held off on buying one. This shot, the Heart Nebula, I did not use a go-to mount. I did that manually each night after night on the star tracker. So you don't need a go-to mount. You can pull it off, but this will save you a lot of time and effort. So same thing, it's counteracting the Earth's rotation, it's giving you those long exposures, it'll go to the place on command. Mine is very inexpensive, $550. These are Canadian prices, just so you know, all the prices I'm quoting are Canadian. So, you know, about 2/3 of an American dollar, if you want to do the math. So mine isn't necessarily meant for astrophotography, but because my telescope and my payload is pretty small, you can use it for that. This is the Skywatcher AZ GTI, and it's running a different firmware you can download, and you can see I've modified it. I've added a counterweight to it, which is just a bolt that I bought at Home Depot and stuck a weight on the end of it. And you know what? It works just fine. No plans to upgrade that one, thank goodness. So here is the Elephant Trunk Nebula. This is using the go-to mount. Actually, I used both mounts for this. This is the reason why I bought the go-to mount. The elephant trunk was positioned directly above me in the night sky. I was laying on my back, moving the telescope night after night trying to find it. It was very tricky to find. It wasn't near a prominent star, so I had to do a lot of trial and error. Shoot, move, until I could line it up. And it was very frustrating. I mean, I was swearing constantly. I'm sure my neighbors were happy when I got the new mount. And, you know, astrophotography is full of frustration, you guys. You're going to meet it every step of the way, and you're going to learn and overcome that frustration. And it's so satisfying when you keep going to the next step. So on this one, I was having a very hard time lining this up night after night, and I snapped and I ordered the go-to mount. I want to give you some advice. I bought a cheap go-to mount, and I said I don't need to upgrade it. If you're getting started, I would suggest buying a better one because it's going to future-proof you. When you get bigger telescopes, you can add it on. So I would recommend getting one that'll hold more weight, and that's custom made for astrophotography. Mine is capable of it, and sure, it works, but you can do better. So eventually I'm going to have to upgrade it, and you know what they say, if you buy cheap, you buy twice. So take my advice, buy a slightly better go-to mount if you're in the market for a go-to mount. Back to this image, it is the elephant trunk in the constellation Cepheus, or at least right next to Cepheus. And yeah, this is using everything we've applied so far, our astronomy camera, our filters, our go-to mount, our auto guiding for 5-minute exposures, and our telescope. And I think the results are fantastic. This is from the heart of the city, from my house. Unbelievable. I never thought that I would be able to make images like this from my home. A lot of people are like, wow, it looks like NASA. And it really does. We're using a lot of the same principles, just on a much smaller scale. Okay, this is section 3.5. I want to talk to you about lucky imaging. So this is a technique that you use to shoot the sun, the moon, and the planets. Lucky imaging is essentially shooting a video clip, and then software is going to take the very nicest frames of that video clip and stack them together into an image. So instead of shooting photos one after another for 5 minutes long, we're going to shoot like a 10 or 15 second video clip, and just pull frames out of it. And the reason being is that our atmosphere causes a bit of wobble. If you've ever looked at a road on a hot day and you've seen the heat coming off the road and it kind of waves back and forth, it's the same thing with the atmosphere. If you look up at the moon, the sun, through your camera, you will see that the atmosphere is wobbling. And what Lucky Imaging does is it just picks up those frames for that brief millisecond when the wobble isn't affecting our image, and it grabs all those good ones and puts them together. So it's a way to beat what we call seeing, bad seeing. So when it's very wavy atmosphere, that would be bad seeing. When the atmosphere is very calm, we call that good seeing. And you can even measure seeing, but we're not going to get that in depth today. Okay, so that's my solar scope and a solar mount. So it automatically tracks the sun. You turn it on, it takes you right to the sun, and it just starts guiding away. And here is my first image of the sun using that same monochromatic camera. And I colorized it in Photoshop. And yeah, it's pretty amazing. You can see up at the top of the image, we have some prominences. We have a sunspot, and I've inverted the image, but you'd think a sunspot would be hot. It's actually cool. It's a place where the convection is kind of stopped and it's cooled down. It's not as hot as the other areas, and that's why it's a different color. There's some spicula, and we're looking at the chromosphere of the sun. My solar telescope focuses in on the sun, on the chromosphere. It's one layer of the sun, and there's some nice detail there that we can get. So this was done with Lucky Imaging. This would be a 10-second video clip, and just pulled the best frames out of it. This is another camera, much smaller sensor, and it helps us kind of punch in even closer. When your sensor gets smaller, your telescope, the field of view gets tighter and tighter. So it mimics having a longer telescope. And that gets us in nice and close to capture some of those details. And again, this is just from my rooftop, and not too shabby. Here's the moon, also done in Lucky Imaging. And Lucky Imaging on the moon, the real benefit is that it gives us a really sharp image because it just takes those really nice frames. You can do the same thing with photography. It's just your files are going to be huge. Your computer is probably going to grind to a halt when you try to process them. Video frames are very light, so your computer can whiz through this. It's very fast process. And here's a close-up. I do the same technique that you just saw in the sun. I use a smaller camera with a tiny little sensor, and that helps us punch in even further. If you know cameras, you know the crop factor. So as a camera sensor gets smaller, the focal length of the lens or telescope attached gets longer and longer, in essence. A simplified way of explaining that. But so you don't necessarily need to buy a bigger telescope. Far cheaper to buy a camera with a smaller sensor, and that gets you in even closer. So, little tip. Here is a photo of the Orion Nebula. Now, it's not a very good photo, but I want you to take a good look at it and just kind of put it in the back of your mind right now. I made this photo using a remote observatory. So in my case, I used itelescope.net. I've been a member for several years now. What's the deal with remote observatories? Well, basically you're renting telescope time over the internet. So in this case, this company has telescopes in New Mexico, in Sierra Nevada mountains of California, in Spain, in Australia, all over the world. And these areas are often high altitude in places where they do not get rain. So you get very clear, very dark, very beautiful skies for astrophotography. Some of them, like Australia, being in the southern hemisphere, means that you can image targets that you can't see here. I'm at the 49th parallel, so northern hemisphere. I can't see a lot of the stuff down south. So there are images that you can only make by either traveling or using a remote telescope. They give you a lot of choice. They have a lot of different telescopes, a lot of really high quality, high-end equipment that I personally can't afford. I don't know about you, but in a minute I'm going to show you something I made on a $100,000 setup for maybe $100. So, very affordable. You could invest in a really big, powerful telescope. I think it's far cheaper to just rent something even better on the few occasions that you actually use it. Another great benefit of using remote observatories is that you can plan your stuff in advance, submit your plan, and it all happens while you sleep. They have very good mounts and computer systems, so you don't have to stay up all night watching it like a hawk. Finally, they give you bonus data. So they shoot images when the telescopes aren't in use. They give you those images, if you're a member. And you can go ahead and edit them to your taste and style. So let's take a look at an image. This is Messier object number 101, the Pinwheel Galaxy. I shot this from the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, which is a great place for astrophotography. A lot of people have their remote telescopes built there. This is shot on a plane wave 24-inch CDK, so 24 inches of aperture, 2 feet of aperture. That's a huge telescope, huge. 4,000 millimeter focal length, so that's going to give us a lot of reach into the night sky. My biggest scope is 1350, so this is going to give us far more distance in our abilities to take pictures of small little galaxies. This telescope would run you $55,000 US plus tax and shipping. The mount alone to hold the telescope, 24 grand. 15 grand for the camera. Just imagine the filters are in the thousands of dollars. The filter wheel, the software, the computer, the observatory with the removable ceiling, all the weather detectors, the maintenance. This is well over $100,000, and I have access to it. I could never have made this image here. My skies are light polluted. This is a color object, so I can't use those narrowband filters I showed you earlier to beat the light pollution. Remote telescope all the way. Beautiful. Well worth it, and it's just another tool in your tool belt as an astrophotographer to make more images and just diversify. I think it's great. I'll never own this telescope. Well, actually, hey, let's knock on wood and hope that one day I do. Fingers crossed. But the fact that I can use something like this is amazing. You can too. Here is some of that free data I talked about. This is only an hour of exposure, and because I'm on a starter plan. The bigger plan that you purchase through the subscription, the more data they give you, and more filters as well. But for an hour, this is a great photo. This is the Sculptor Galaxy. And here is the Iris Nebula. So they give you data every couple of weeks, every month, and it's just more images for you to be able to create. I think it's great fun. And what you can always do, I think is very cool, is you could take the data that they give you free, you could use some of your time on the telescope to shoot that same target and add your data to the data they give you. And it's kind of like just some bonus material. So you can make an even better image. Like if I spent some money, shot the same object, stacked that data with the data they gave me, I get an even better photo for cheaper. So I think that's really cool that they offer that. Now, I am on the council. I'm a council member at large of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And I'll tell you something, membership has its benefits. So we have our own remotely controlled robotic telescope, and it's also in the Sierra Nevada mountains where the other telescope I just used was. I imagine they're about 30 feet apart in the same complex, actually. So if you're a member of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, you can go ahead and purchase 2 years worth of data from the telescope for $99. And there are dozens and dozens of targets. They also have a DSLR with a long lens riding shotgun on that big telescope. And it gives you a huge variety in the objects that you can download and edit. And the data is really, really good. So here is one. This is the Whirlpool Galaxy. This is a galaxy that's becoming one with a dwarf galaxy that is orbiting it. So they're going to become one galaxy eventually. We will not be around to see that. It'll happen in the very distant future. So yeah, remote control telescopes offer you a way of using amazing equipment in amazing locations, and for a very small fraction of the price that it would cost to own and operate this equipment. So I know a lot of great astrophotographers, and they shoot their own stuff, but they also have their own remote observatories now that are private. And so being able to rent one. I mean, it puts you in league with the big boys. Not bad place to be. Let's talk about data processing. I'm not going to get very in-depth here because it's very elaborate, and I just want to give you an idea of what the process looks like to process an astrophoto. There's that photo. My very first astrophoto, by the way. I took this at the beginning of the pandemic. This is 1 hour of data from a remote telescope in New Mexico. And it's about an hour's worth of data. This is about 60 minutes worth of shots. I think I did 4 filters for 15 minutes each. So 1 hour of data. I mean, it was probably very affordable. It's probably like $20. And this is the edit. This is my edited version. And I want to show you after 1 year. So this is my first astrophoto I ever made. After 1 year of doing astrophotography, I took the exact same photos and tried to edit them again with what I've learned. So I want to show you the difference in experience that 1 year of astrophotography makes. Right? It's like night and day difference. So you keep picking up tricks, you keep learning software, you keep watching YouTube, following tutorials. You're watching guys like Astro Backyard, maybe Chuck's Astrophotography. Shout out to guys like that who help us learn how to improve. We get to stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from these guys. And the same data a year later. So it always pays to go back. You can always add more data as well. I could shoot the same object again this year on the same telescope, add even more quality to it, and then now I have 2 years of editing experience. What kind of image could I make if I did that? It would be even more superior to this. I know the colors are a little wonky if you know astrophotography, but I overcooked this one a little. But yeah. So no experience to 1 year. Okay, so post-processing in a nutshell. How do we do it? We use stacking software. It can be free. It can be subscription. You can purchase it. And in that order, Deep Sky Stacker is free. Start on that. AstroPixel Processor, a little more feature-rich, and you can purchase that. It's a little more affordable than the really high-end stuff, but it is amazing. It's also a very high-end astro processing software. And then up at the end here, we have Pix Insight. That's sort of the industry standard. It's very technical. I feel like it was designed by engineers for engineers. I'm a photographer, not an engineer. I don't have a background in astronomy. I take pictures. AstroPixel Processor is the one I'm going to recommend to you because it's a good middle ground. It's going to do the job very well, and it's intuitive enough that you're going to be able to learn it without too much of a headache. The learning curve is steep, but I got over it. You can too. Trust me. I'm here to support you. Message me if you have problems. I'll help you get through it. So why do we stack images? Why do we take hundreds of images and stack them? Well, it improves our signal to noise ratio. So the signal is the nebula or galaxy we're trying to shoot, and the noise is all that long exposure noise and random noise generated by the camera sensor. So stacking the images together with software will help boost that signal to noise ratio and give us a very clean image that looks very beautiful. After we've stacked that image in Astro processing software, what we're going to do is basically edit it just like any other photo. We're going to adjust our color and our contrast, maybe our curves and levels, brightness, sharpness, your typical photo editing. And I do it just like typical photo editing. I do it in Photoshop and Lightroom. Photoshop and Lightroom will run you $10 a month for the subscription. That is not bad. As far as Adobe goes, that is the subscription that I recommend. Very affordable, $10 a month, very powerful. It's good value, well worth it, well worth it. A couple other things we might do to an astrophoto are reduce the stars. Sometimes the stars of the Milky Way around us are so many they can be overpowering. So if we reduce the size of those stars a little bit, it'll allow our target to kind of shine through a bit more and take center stage in our photo. So star reduction is definitely a bonus. A lot of people remove the green from their images, like I mentioned earlier. No green in space. So you want to say hasta la vista to that green. Personally, I leave green in my images because I like color. I take a bit more creative liberty. I'm not trying to be very like scientific and spot on with this. I want to make images that please me first and foremost. So I like having the additional color of green, and I like seeing colors transition, let's say from green to yellow or to teal, green to blue. I like to see all those different tones come together and not just be super super regimented about the colors. I just, I do it by eye. I don't do it by stringent rules. Okay, so yeah, we get some software, stack our images. This is kind of what it looks like, and I called it, I believe, data management a couple slides ago, and that's because it very much is data management. We're taking files, we're stacking them, we're sorting through them for quality, we're going to ignore bad ones, and we're going to use different processing algorithms to do things like reduce light pollution and reject things like maybe a frame with an airplane that flew through it or some cloud. So it'll automatically say, hey, this photo isn't up to par. Let's ditch it and just use the good stuff. So it can reject bad stuff, keep good stuff. We also use our calibration frames. I mentioned earlier that in astrophotography, we put the lens cap on and we basically shoot duplicate images to help reduce the noise in the image, and we input those into our software to help us achieve that. There are other calibration frames, which I'm not going to get into right now because it gets quite complicated. Everything about astrophotography is complicated, but that challenge is what makes it so rewarding. So we wrangle this data, and we're stacking our images. Well, what does that actually look like? Here's one image of the Andromeda Galaxy, a single 5-minute exposure. What does it look like when you stack it with 100 other images? Something like that. You can see the jagged edges of my frame here. These jagged edges are the different nights that I imaged Andromeda. So you can see that it's stacked all these different nights of images together, and this is all through one filter. We shot 5 filters for this. We did LRGB and hydrogen alpha, a narrowband filter. So 5 filters stacked together. Doesn't look that much different, does it? But there is some color in there. If you look closely, you see a nice orange glow in the center, and you see a bit of blue on the outside. So we stacked this in AstroPixel Processor, and now we're going to take this image over into Photoshop and Lightroom and edit it to look like this. Very different. So that's where the photo editing comes in. I mean, in space, I think gases would be pretty diffuse. They wouldn't be all that colorful to the naked eye. But through the power of photography and stacking images to boost that signal-to-noise ratio, we really start to build up the color, build up the detail, make it very dramatic so that we can appreciate it in the form of a photograph. I was very honored that an editor of a photography magazine called Sky News actually asked if she could run this as her editor's article that month. And yeah, very flattering for me being new in the field, and very proud of this image being taken from the city, because this is a color image, RGB, so there's not much narrowband in here, so I had to deal with the noise pollution making this image. This is the North American and Pelican Nebula. You can see on the right, it sort of resembles a pelican. And to the left, it kind of looks like the outline of the continent of North America. Some people see Deadpool's mask. If you look at the pelican's beak and eye, you can sort of see like 2 glowing eyes there, and it kind of looks like Deadpool's mask a little bit. I did this as a bicolor image with just 2 filters, and just to do something a little different than the typical kind of Hubble look. This is the typical Hubble look, narrowband. And this is the Sol Nebula. So you remember the Heart Nebula I showed you earlier? The first real astro photo I made with my own telescope. This is a Sol Nebula. It's right next door. They're almost on top of each other in the night sky. With a wide telescope, you can see them both. I shot them separately, and I flipped this one around, and to me it looks like a little baby buffalo kind of charging through the night sky in a way. You might recognize this one. These are the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, aka the Subaru logo. And again, this is a true color image, so hard to do from the city. I used a light pollution filter and did my best, but you can only do so much with a color image from the city because it's very susceptible to light pollution. Whereas something like this, which is narrow band filters, different filter set, these can really help eliminate the light pollution. So the fact that I got anything at all, I'm very happy with it. I mean, every astrophoto is a bit of a victory where I live. Here's a terrestrial image. I pointed my telescope at the moon as it was rising and got it coming up behind the buildings downtown, which is very cool. I think getting the moon tied up in like a bridge and buildings can be very cool. You can take your telescope out with you on a tripod. It's just a single shot like a regular photo. No stacking, no fancy processing, just one photo. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's rare that you can use a telescope that big and get both the sky and the land in one shot. This is Comet Neowise. This is, a year and a half ago now, I guess. And that's the Grouse Mountain Ski Resort in the foreground. These are two images put together. I was tracking Neowise with my star tracker, took a bunch of photos of it, and then I stopped the star tracker and I took the photo of Grouse Mountain for the foreground so that I could composite that on top. So that was the actual distance and the comet was there, but because the telescope was moving, it would have been a blurry foreground. So I actually stopped the star tracker when I thought it was at a good spot and I shot just the foreground image. This was done with a DSLR and telescope on the star tracker with no guiding, just cruising. So a very bare bones setup to make that image. I should go back and reprocess this actually. Could probably make it look a lot better. Here is Sol, our sun. Mithras, if you watch Raised by Wolves TV show. So yeah, I think this is my favorite solar image. I haven't done a lot of solar imaging so far, but you can see there's some nice solar storms going on. Very small prominence up in the top right, but some nice sunspots and a lot of great detail on the solar surface. And not bad. Zooming in 93 million miles, I would say. So again, these are black and white images from a monochrome camera, and then in Photoshop I colorize them. And I use software, I run a Mac, so I'm using Parallels, and then I use free software like AutoStackert to create these images. Another shot of the moon, and I'm always trying to get closer and closer in on the moon. Here's a fun one. This is the moon, fairly high resolution, and what I've done is I've inverted the colors. So I just flipped the color. If you're on Photoshop, it's literally just Control-I. Will invert the color. And I think it gives a fun, surreal look. It makes it look a little bit sci-fi, and maybe even like it's winter on the moon or something. And astrophotography is really art and science coming together. I think you'll see a lot of people who are very set in their way and they think astrophotography should look a certain way, that maybe you should follow NASA's Hubble shots to the letter. And if you do anything artistic outside of that, you know, it's just not right in their eyes, and they're very vocal online. If you want to invert your images, if you want to leave green in your shots, if you want to make things purple, fluorescent, neon, it doesn't matter. It's up to you. I'm going to give you permission to give yourself permission to make whatever image you want. Don't let anyone tell you what the rules are. So if you want to invert an image and make it surreal, go right ahead. It's good fun. And I actually hope that you will experiment and do some things that are a bit different, just for the sake of being creative. All right, another comet. And I hate to say it, but I have to count my lucky stars for this one. It was cloudy all week. This is Comet Leonard, a very recent comet, you might remember. Comet Leonard was flying through the night sky, made a lot of buzz in the newspaper, and here in Vancouver it was cloudy night after night after night. And one night it said that there was going to be some breaks. So I set up all my gear, I was ready to go, and there were no breaks. And then at about 4 o'clock in the morning, the clouds parted above me, and there was Comet Leonard. And at that time, in my field of view, there was also the M3 star cluster, which you see on the left-hand side of the image here. So I was so fortunate to not only get the comet, but to get it with something else in the frame, something as iconic as a whole star cluster. So yeah, it's not the best image because, I mean, the clouds only parted for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, so I couldn't get a lot of data. So it's a bit noisy, but hey, I'll take what I can get. I mean, beggars can't be choosers, right? This is the Rosette Nebula. I think it's obvious how it got its name. Most nebula are named after whatever we can try to make sense of and identify. So this looks like a little bit of a rosebud, or a rosette, if you will. This is a bicolor image, so I just used 2 filters, and oxygen and hydrogen, which give it the red and the blue. And then where they blend, it creates kind of a white. And I like it. It's just sort of a simplified image. Sometimes I go with this color palette just to simplify things, and I really like the reds that it produces, to be honest. This is the exact same photo, flipped on its side, and I've added the 3rd filter in, sulfur. So it's oxygen, hydrogen, and sulfur narrowband filters. And this is the classic Hubble palette, yet you'll see I left that green in there. I think when blue and yellow combine, you know, it's not bad having green to kind of add that 3rd color and just round it out a bit more. I mean, that's what happens when you combine those colors anyway. And so you have red going into orange, going into yellow, going into blue, going into teal, going into green. And I like to leave it because it just creates that beautiful transition. It's kind of all the colors of the rainbow philosophy. And for me, the more color in an image, the merrier. I enjoy it. So it's, you know, highly subjective. It's up to you. The other thing I did with this particular image is I turned it sideways. So you see here it looks like a rosette. I think it looks a lot like a skull when you turn it on its side, so it's a little more badass. These would make 2 good tattoos, right? Like a rose and a skull. Moving on. Can you guess what it's called? No, it's not the Eagle Nebula. The Eagle Nebula is a different nebula. This is the Seagull Nebula. It's okay if you got it wrong. I got it wrong. So I'm extremely proud of this image because it is very low on the horizon where I live, and right below it is the international airport. So there's a lot of light pollution in that area. So the fact that I could make an image of this at all was very lucky, very fortunate. This is one that I need to revisit, shoot some more data on it, especially oxygen, which would be the blue color, and I can get even more blue down in the bottom part of those wings, would be wonderful. So I need to spend a couple more nights this summer imaging this and bring out some more detail there. But yeah, just a beautiful, beautiful object in space, the Seagull Nebula, fantastic. This is what's known as the Cygnus Loop. And this is the remnant of a star that went supernova a very long time ago. You know, many thousands of years ago, the star exploded. What you see here is the shock wave of gas leaving the area. And it's excited with all that energy, causing the gases to glow. When these gases lose and gain electrons, it causes them to become excited and light up. And that's what we're seeing here. It's just phenomenal. Somewhere at the center of this image is the core of the dead star, which is pretty outstanding. All these gases and elements are now going to spread out, and you never know. I mean, all the elements in the universe come from dying stars, just like everything on Earth. All the elements, all the gold, all the aluminum, everything. It all came from a dying star. Some of these elements may end up on a planet one day and, you know, be used in constructing a house or a telescope or something. It really boggles the mind to think about how the universe works this way and how stars have to die and explode for planets to form and for life to exist. So stars have to die so that we can live. Like Carl Sagan said, we are star stuff. This is the Horsehead and Flame Nebula. The very bright blue star above the Flame Nebula there is actually the leftmost star in Orion's belt. Sorry, drawing a blank. It's been a long presentation. So when you see Orion's belt, the 3 stars, that is the leftmost star. And, you know, it's a very iconic constellation in the sky. And to think, you know, Orion's Nebula, which we saw earlier, the Horsehead and Flame Nebula, which we're seeing here, they're all in that area. It's such a rich part of our galaxy, just full of gases and clouds and all sorts of things happening in the night sky. It's phenomenal. And I think this is probably my favorite image because I had seen the Horsehead before, thanks to NASA. So it's very iconic. And to be able to image it myself, make my own version of it, it meant a lot. And I'm really looking forward to either when I get a bigger telescope or maybe I'll rent some telescope time on a remote observatory so I can get in nice and tight on that Horsehead and maybe make a nice print for the wall. So again, this is a lot of data. I believe this one's 18 hours of exposure. I would have liked to have given it some more, but it had started going below the horizon at that point in the year. So some of these images like this, I've shot a lot more shots in this past season, and so I can make a bigger view of this and add more data. And I've done that with several shots. The elephant trunk, which we saw earlier, this one. I'm going to shoot more data on this in the coming year. And the cool thing about astrophotography is you can always add more images to your previous to create an even higher quality image in the future. And also your editing skills are probably better by the time you do it. So there's a progression that you can do in astrophotography that's kind of different than most photography. You can keep revisiting things, getting better, keep upgrading your gear, upgrading your skills, and just keep progressing. I don't think there's any limit to how far you can progress. Whereas something like a portrait, your lighting and camera can only get so good and it's just going to look the same. So astrophotography provides a very worthy challenge that you can always just keep pushing forward and advancing your skill set. That is going to wrap up this introduction to astrophotography. I know there was probably a lot of confusing things said. There's a lot of equipment. There's a lot to it, a lot of different types of photography, and hopefully it raised some questions. So this shouldn't be a one-way street. I'm not telling this to you. It's a discussion, so please feel free to connect with me, especially if you're thinking of getting into astrophotography. Reach out to me. These are the best places. YouTube, which we're on right now, obviously. You can hit up my website. Quite often I'm selling photography prints. If you want to support the channel and the show, you could always buy a photographic print. I have some new astrophotography stuff coming out soon. Instagram at supercreative with an 8. And, you know, that's where you see the images get posted, as well as all the other different genres of photography I partake in. But yeah, reach out, add me as a friend, send me an email. Let's continue the discussion. Hit up the comments below if you have a question or a comment. You probably know something that I don't. Give me some tips, give me some pointers. I'm open to learning from you as well. So let's make this a community. Let's make it a discussion. And as I say at the end of every episode of Robservatory, don't take my word for it. I want you to see for yourself. Clear skies, my friends.